I'm Frank Day, an original Ironman and the inventor of PowerCranks. I've been selling PowerCranks for about 15 years now, and in this time, I've learned an awful lot about how to get faster on a bicycle. The recent availability of cranks that allow us to measure pedaling technique has really been a catalyst to let me put all that I've learned together in a way I think everyone can understand. This presentation represents my current thoughts on the subject. There's so much more to reaching one's full potential than just training hard. Training harder will make you faster, of course, but training smarter is really the icing on the cake. In this presentation, I'm going to give you the information you need to train smarter, a lot smarter, to get faster, a lot faster. Enjoy. I'm going to talk about 4 basic things today. First, pedaling technique, what it is and why it matters. 2, crank length. You all know what that is, but why it matters. 3, aerodynamics, how it interacts with technique and crank length. And 4, new tools and possibilities. In this presentation, I'm mostly going to be talking about optimizing time trial and triathlon type bike riding, because this type of riding involves all aspects of riding fast. The first thing required to ride fast is a lot of power. A lot of you already know this, and as a result, many of you own power meters. Of course, there's no evidence that knowing your power helps you to gain power or to race better, but this may simply be because very few know how to use this device. One real problem with owning a power meter, though, is there is a tendency to focus on power and ignore the other aspects of going fast. Doing this could slow you down. Next is aerodynamics. Good power and good aerodynamics together are the key to a good time trial performance. When part of a group like a peloton, aerodynamics and position are of very little importance, but for triathlon and time trialing, these two together are extremely important. The problem is optimizing one frequently hurts the other. Plus, for longer races, comfort comes into play. The more aerodynamic positions are usually very difficult to hold for any length of time. This is because the head sticking out way in front of the shoulders and the neck isn't used to supporting it for hours at a time in this position. I'm not going to address comfort in this presentation. So in time trial type racing, the competing interests are all right there. And no one really understands how to truly maximize the total result. But I know how to get close, and that is my goal here, to help you to understand what I've learned so you can put this knowledge into practice for yourself. Let's start with talking about how we generate power on a bicycle. Pedaling technique. That's the pressure the muscles apply to the pedals, is how cyclists generate power to drive the bicycle. But there's a problem. When scientists talk about pedaling technique, one of the above is generally what they are talking about. The illustration on the left is called a vector analysis and shows how the direction and magnitude of the pedal forces change as the foot moves around the pedaling circle. The graph in the middle looks at the tangential component and translates the vector analysis into showing how the instantaneous power varies around the circle. On the right is a surface EMG analysis looking at when the different muscles are contracting. The EMG analysis isn't very useful because it isn't possible to analyze the deeper muscles, nor does this say anything about how these contractions result in actual pedal forces. I will ignore this going forward and concentrate on the resultant pedal forces that allow us to calculate power. These measurements represent how almost everyone pedals. Of course, there are small variations. Some push harder, some have less negative on the backstroke, etc. One thing though, when scientists have tried to analyze these measured forces and see if they can predict efficiency from these differences, they find no correlation. As a result of this failure, most cyclists have concluded that pedaling technique doesn't matter, and what is most important in generating power is just pushing harder. This makes no sense to an engineer. The efficiency of the force application must affect overall efficiency. So let's look at this closer. First, some basics. We notice there is a lot of variation in power around the circle, ranging here from about 450 watts at about 105 degrees and minus 50 watts at about 290 degrees. But what does your power meter show? It shows the average of all that is done around the circle, which in this instance is about 125 watts. So what matters is not how hard you push per se, but what is the average of all that you do or don't do around the circle. What you don't do on the backstroke subtracts from what is done on the downstroke. Adding an extra watt on the downstroke is no more effective than adding a watt anywhere else in the circle. Now that we understand how pedaling technique relates to what we see on our power meter, let's go back and look more carefully and see if we can explain why there doesn't seem to be a relationship between technique as measured by the scientists and efficiency or anything else. First, let's define technique as the forces that result from the muscle coordination used to accomplish a task. Of course, for this purpose, we're talking about the muscle coordination used to pedal a bike. But this isn't what the scientists are measuring here. Then what are they measuring? These graphs represent the total forces seen by the pedals, and there are 4 different forces contributing to what is measured. 1, gravity. The gravity force will vary depending on the build of the rider. Gravity always points down and really confuses the interpretation of this data, making it look like we do more work on the downstroke than we do, and making it look like we do less work on the upstroke than we do. 2, inertial forces. These come from the constant acceleration and deceleration of the leg and thigh as it pumps up and down. These also mostly point up and down, but can be either positive or negative, again confusing the picture. And 3, centrifugal forces from the circular motion of the foot and pedal. This force is always outward and only muddies the vector force analysis. This is made even more complicated by the fact that 2 and 3 on this list vary with the square of the cadence. Then the 4th force, muscle forces. Because all of the variables, it is hardly any wonder that the vector analysis that includes all these non-muscular forces may not correlate well with pedaling efficiency, because pedaling efficiency should only be dependent upon the muscle forces. So it seems the problem might be the definition of pedaling technique used by the researchers. Can anything be done to allow us to see what the muscles are doing? Luckily, mechanical engineering principles allow us, if we have enough information, to calculate the non-muscular forces through a technique called reverse engineering. This was done in this case, and the non-muscular forces are revealed. Note that they even point up at TDC due to the inertial and centrifugal forces there, and they can be quite large, up to 160 watts here, but they always average out to be 0. Now that we know that the non-muscular forces, we can subtract these forces from the total, and we can see what the muscles are doing now. The tan line representing what the muscles are actually doing. Note that we are not pushing nearly as hard as everyone thinks on the downstroke, and actually doing some work on the backstroke. The minimum force is not on the upstroke as everyone thinks, but across the top. This is how almost everyone pedals, and what everyone thinks is going on, looking at the total forces display, has little resemblance to what the muscles are actually doing. Before I move on, I think it's reasonable to ask the question, why do we pedal this way? Is this the best our muscles can do? We all pedal this way because we all learned to pedal as children on platform pedals, that is, not attached to the pedals. And this is the only technique that allows you to efficiently pedal a bicycle with this equipment. But even more important, this method of pedaling became ingrained into our nervous system in our formative years, just like being right-handed or left-handed, walking or running. So it is what we do without thinking, and ingrained patterns are not easily changed. Let's look specifically at what the equipment taught us. At top dead center, where we are weakest, on platform pedals, the pedal is moving forward, and the quads are positioned to be able to provide a lot of power here if we push hard in the direction the pedal is moving. But as soon as the pedal starts to fall away, we would lose contact with the pedal if we were pushing hard, and to ride a bicycle, one must maintain contact with the pedal at all times. So, at the top, the quads are held back substantially from what they could do just so we can keep contact with the pedal and continue riding the bike. On the backstroke, a similar situation applies. We can do some work here, unweighting, but only as long as we don't completely unweight and lose contact again. So again, we learn to hold back beyond what the muscles can do just to keep contact with the pedal. At the bottom, we can do a little more than the top because we can tip our toe down some to help us keep contact when we pull back. But because the pedal is moving down before BDC, we must still hold back to keep contact. This probably explains why the bottom forces are a little larger than the top. Only on the downstroke can we push as hard as our muscles can and not risk losing contact with the pedal. This pattern is now explained. We all pedal the same way because we all learned on the same equipment which forced a certain technique, and this technique became ingrained into our brains. Now let's ask if it's possible to change. To use more fully those muscles we learned, we must hold back. The first thing we need to do to change is to attach our foot to the pedal. We all know this because isn't that why we all have either toe clips or clipless pedals? But attaching ourselves to the pedal only means we can change, not that we do change. The earlier pedaling technique we looked at was from an elite cyclist, so it is clear getting clipless pedals doesn't cause us to change. Why? We don't change because this is an ingrained unconscious pattern, and it requires both feedback and hours of practice doing a new technique to change ingrained habits. One way people have tried to change is by doing isolated leg drills. Isolated leg drills train pedaling in circles one leg at a time. These don't work because they don't retrain the two-legged coordination. So there is no feedback to change what we do with two legs, and most only do these drills for only a few minutes at a time. How's that going to help for a 5-hour bike ride? Isolated leg drills fail because they do not train the two-legged coordination, but only train the muscles, and they don't do a very good job of that. This brings us to PowerCranks, a training tool designed specifically to change the way you pedal a bicycle. What do they do? First, they give positive feedback when you're pedaling using proper basic technique. Second, they provide negative feedback whenever you have a break in technique, as they simply fall apart and stop working. Next, they can be used for all of your bicycle riding, so they can give you the hours and hours of training required to change the ingrained patterns and to train the new muscles to the necessary endurance level. Change requires changing both the ingrained pattern and the muscles necessary to perform the new task, so they should work. The next question you might ask is, how effective are they in making this change? Well, let's take a look. Let me compare the measured pattern of a person trained on PowerCranks to that of our first cyclist. We can see the pedal forces of the PowerCrank are substantially different than that of the typical cyclist for the same power, 125 watts here. The peak forces are less, and there are no negative forces at the minimum. But these are the total forces. How do they compare if we look at the muscle forces? Let's subtract the non-muscular forces. Wow, that's some difference. We can see the power is essentially equal around the entire circle. This is what's meant by pedaling in perfect circles. The average is what he's doing everywhere. it's clear we have unlocked the potential of those muscles at the top, bottom, and back of the stroke that we're originally taught to hold back when we were learning to ride a bike. Remember when I said that no studies had shown a correlation between pedaling technique and pedaling efficiency? Well, that wasn't quite right. There is one study by Leerdahl from 2011 in which pedaling efficiency correlated well with what the cyclist did in the dead center area, the top and the bottom, the weakest areas of most people's stroke. And there's a second study by Luttrell in 2003 that showed that pedaling efficiency improved after PowerCranks training. And even though this author didn't measure technique, we know that one of the things PowerCranks training does is improve the top and bottom areas in most people's stroke. The reason this correlation exists is probably because at ordinary cadences, the non-muscular forces are close to zero at both the top and the bottom. So this makes the total forces essentially equal to the muscular forces at these positions. Since the non-muscular forces are usually small here, the total force measured is close to the actual muscle force. So it seems there could be an overall benefit to using this technique. Have there been any studies? A Canadian multi-university study by Dixon in 2006 looked at PowerCranks immersion training in trained cyclists, 8 hours a week, and demonstrated a 15% increase in VO2 max and 11% increase in maximum power after only 6 weeks. Another study by Luttrell demonstrated a 10% increase in cycling efficiency in only 6 weeks of training. That's all well and good, but what happens to real people? Our typical new user is gaining 2 to 3 miles an hour in bike speed improvement after 6 months of immersion training. Plus, most triathletes also see about 1 minute per mile improvement in running pace in about 3 months. This could be a 20 to 30 minute improvement in an Ironman bike split at the pointy end and about an hour improvement in the slower end of the scale. Plus, most of these people see a 1 minute per mile improvement in their running pace also. This is so large, most think such improvements are impossible. They are not. Many like to look at the cost per second gained when comparing equipment. For most of our users, the cost ranges from about 10 to 50 cents per second for an Ironman. No tool is more cost effective. Phil HOLMAN was a Masters track cyclist and was one of those who thought such improvement was impossible in a well-trained cyclist. I challenged him to use them exclusively and report to the group. In 7 months, he had increased his pursuit speed from 30 to 32 miles an hour. His max speed increased from 35 to 38 miles an hour, and he won a bronze medal at Worlds. He no longer believes such improvement impossible in such a short period. Sam GYDE won the 35 to 39 age group at Kona 4 years in a row, despite swimming in the 110 to 112 range. It helps to have a 4:30 bike split and 3-hour run, methinks. JOAQUIN Rodriguez is a Spanish master cyclist who got himself tested before starting on PowerCranks so he could document the changes, and then he trained exclusively on PowerCranks, testing himself again at 7 and 13 months. What did he see? Well, at 7 months, his VO2 max had improved from 4960 to 5600, a 13% increase, and his relative VO2 had increased from 71 to 83 per kilogram. His FTP1 increased from 284 to 358, a 26% increase. Another interesting change is he increased his FTP1 effort from 79% of his max to 89% of his max, indicating much better muscle balance. At 13 months, his VO2 max further improved to 5790, with his VO2 per kilogram increasing to 85.5, a 17% increase, and his FTP1 further increased to 394, a 39% increase at 87% of his VO2 max. Wow! If you don't consider these results amazing, there's something wrong with you. His coach told him he was at the level of the pros, the only difference being he couldn't do it day after day because he couldn't recover like them. There are many, many examples of such improvement. Yes, technique does matter. Pay attention to the next example. Andrew Starykowitz has the fastest bike splits ever in both Ironman and half Ironman. Let me be clear. I don't know if Andrew is a power cranker or not, but he pedals like one, as he has a video out describing pedaling technique. Google Orca Flash Tip number 4 and see what he says. Congratulations to him. He is the first person I've heard of, other than me, who describes actually adding power on the backstroke and over the top. How do you pedal compared to him? What are you going to do about it? PowerCranks change technique for the better, the much better. Next, let's talk about crank length. Now that you understand technique can be important to power generation and efficiency, let's discuss crank length. Before discussing this subject, how about a couple of facts first? Adult cyclists vary in size from about 58 inches to 76 inches, a 31% difference. Yet, 99% of these riders ride cranks ranging from 170 to 175 millimeters, a 3% difference. Don't you find that just a bit strange? Now, I gotta admit, crank length doesn't make much difference to the vast majority of riders. The only ones who should care about this are those who are trying to maximize either power or aerodynamics. If you don't care about maximizing your power or aerodynamics, you can move on now. But if you do, hopefully, I've now got your attention, so listen up. Let's look at the science. Few studies have looked at power and crank length, but here is the result of the most frequently referenced one. What? The study measured power highest at the 145 millimeter crank length? How come no one has ever told you about this? Well, the reason is the author looked at this data and then concluded that since the difference was small and didn't reach statistical significance, that nothing is lost with continuing to ride 170 millimeter cranks. Because a scientist drew this conclusion, this study is frequently presented as proof that crank length doesn't matter. Well, I suppose that may be true if you're riding to the grocery store or around the park with kids, but I don't know many competitive athletes who'd be willing to give up any power, small or not. Why didn't he just conclude that this surprising result demands further study? But, alas, he didn't. The first question most ask about shorter cranks is, why doesn't the decreased leverage of the shorter crank lose power? Well, the reason is, the more the knee is bent, the more leverage the knee loses. Can you lift more weight doing a half squat or a full squat? Crank length is only one lever between the muscles and the wheel. Increasing the leverage of the crank seems to decrease the leverage of the knee. Further, there are two more issues with this study that might affect you. First, it was done in adult men. If this had been done in shorter people, like women, I suspect everything would be shifted to the left and the most powerful crank length would be even shorter than 145. Second, it was done in the standard upright cycling position. Does this have any bearing on what is best for the time trial aerodynamic position? I suspect not. When is someone going to do a study looking at crank length in the aero position and how that affects power? Well, it doesn't matter because it's now easy enough for you to do this study on yourself to see how crank length affects you. Here's an example of the kind of testing you could do. This athlete has an espresso bike system, which is similar to a CompuTrainer in that it saves previous rides and lets you ride against yourself or other athletes over prescribed courses. In this instance, he rode a course twice in identical fashion, only changing crank length from 175 to 145. Here is the heart rate profile of the two rides. You can see his heart rate averaged 10 beats per minute lower with the shorter cranks, demonstrating an efficiency improvement. This is the kind of experimenting everyone can and should do to find the optimum crank length for them. Most of our customers who have seriously experimented with this have gone shorter, with many settling on crank length in the 135 to 155 range. Pro triathlete Courtney Ogden won Ironman Western Australia on 145 cranks. How can you tell if your current cranks might be too long? Here's a simple test to get you started. Take your current crank length and double it. That's how high your cranks force you to lift your foot every revolution. For 170 cranks, that's about 14 inches. Now stand on the floor and lift one foot. You should have no trouble lifting way more than 14 inches because you do that every time you get on the bike and clip in. Now bend at the waist and put yourself in a really good aero position. Back and chest flat, parallel to the ground. Now lift that foot and see how high you can get it off the floor. If you're anywhere close to 14 inches, you're probably a circus contortionist. You are now getting an idea as to how crank length affects performance in a good aero position and what the longest crank length you should be riding it should be if you want to be in an excellent position and still generate good power. You will see that the lower you are, the harder it is to lift your foot, and if you are too low, you are going to lose power unless your cranks are shorter. I think this is so important that most PowerCranks models now allow you to experiment over a wide range to help you find your optimum crank length without guessing. Don't let your equipment limit your potential because it's easiest for the bike manufacturers and bike shops to have a one-size-fits-all approach to crank length. You just have to do the testing for yourself as to what is best for you. You should ride the longest cranks that you can that allow you to attain an excellent aero position without losing power or efficiency. PowerCranks make this easy for you to figure out because most of our models have adjustable crank lengths, so you can experiment and find out what works best for you. So now we can see that a shorter crank length doesn't lower power necessarily. Let's look at how changing crank length affects bike fit. When you shorten your cranks 10 millimeters, you should raise your seat 10 millimeters to keep your fit about the same. Here I am on 190 cranks. Notice my elbows are about the level of my seat, and the bike won't allow them to go any lower. My position is similar to a lot of triathletes, not as high as some, but not very low. Watch what happens to my position as I shorten the cranks to 90 millimeters. The white lines compare how the fit changed as I shortened the cranks, raising the seat and not moving the handlebars. Note, as the cranks shortened, the drop increased from the seat to the bars almost 100 millimeters. That's almost 4 inches. The back and the chest flattened, making for a smaller frontal area. Plus, there is a less cramped hip angle at the top of the stroke, which would allow me to drop my bars even further if I could do so without losing power. That would allow me to get an even smaller frontal area. In our experience, most people can also drop their bars about the same amount as they shorten their cranks, which would double the position change seen here. I think it's clear that this one simple change, shortening crank length, can improve aerodynamics and or improve your ability to generate power. If power isn't lost, then what isn't to like here if your goal is to go faster? If you don't experiment with this for yourself, you are wasting a big opportunity to find some free speed. Now let's move on and talk about the new power and technique measuring devices coming to the market. More of these will be coming to the market, I'm sure. Regardless of the product, the question you should be asking is, will the information be useful to you? I've already shown that the vector output display is almost impossible to interpret. Watch out for devices with that kind of data display. But there is a system that does give useful information you can use. iCranks are a technique measuring crank that should be commercially available soon. iCranks are especially unique because they are really power cranks that measure technique. So Not only do they measure technique, they give you the best tool to change your technique to something better. In addition, they also include the ability to experiment with crank length. In my opinion, their display is actually useful. It's a one-stop shopping. Here is an example. Remember the PowerCranker? This is what his pedaling stroke looked like on the iCranks. Here I've superimposed a circle in black over his actual stroke in green. They are almost identical. With iCranks, a circular pedal stroke looks like a circle. Isn't that amazing? What does a more normal cyclist look like? Well, less than perfect circles deviate from a circle on this display, so analysis is pretty easy. Here is the technique of a cyclist I measured in an expo. He was pretty bad. What can we say about looking at this? Well, the red negative stands out, but how circular is it? How is he balanced top to bottom? From a circular point of view, let's eyeball the left leg for this analysis. He looks squashed at the back and the top to me. I would say this is where he is weak. But next I've superimposed a true circle over his technique to see how close we got by eyeballing it. Compared to the true circle that is balanced top and bottom, suggests he is weaker over a much more extensive section than was obvious from the eyeball analysis, being weak from about 6 o'clock all the way to about 4. He is circular only through about 20% of his stroke. This display allows us to do a detailed analysis to compare what we might expect if we were pedaling, doing equal work around the circle. What we can see is this display actually gives useful information that we can interpret and use if we are interested in discovering pedaling technique weaknesses and improving them. Of course, PowerCranks uncover and correct most of these weaknesses without displaying them. Measuring them, though, can reassure us that they have done their job. But here is the real power of the iCrank system that I believe. They can be put on a bike and technique data can be gathered during long rides or even during races. Peter looked pretty good here when he was fresh, but what I really want to know is what happens when he gets tired. What your technique looks like when tired is key. That to me would dictate where his training should go. If his technique changes, then when he tires, he has more aerobic work to do. If not, we can concentrate on increasing power. Races are won during the last hour, not the first. iCranks are not available right now being May 2015. But it doesn't matter because PowerCranks fix most issues without measuring them. PowerCranks do the heavy lifting of fixing the big problems. iCranks are for diagnosing and fine-tuning. PowerCranks are the most amazing training tool designed to actually improve the athlete. Make PowerCranks part of your regular training and you will see improvements you can only dream of now. Bike faster, run faster, guaranteed. Thanks for listening.